The Viltrumites are a race already known for their brutality, but just how brutal are they really? Today, let's take a deep dive into some of the most disturbing Viltrumite traditions to better understand the Viltrumite Empire. Starting off, of course, with the World Betterment Committee, a relatively new practice from the Viltrum Empire. A select few candidates are chosen to make their way to populated worlds in order to help those people. We, of course, know that this is a lie. The real goal of the World Betterment Committee is to infiltrate and weaken the world for easier conquering. The greatest example of this in the show and comics is, of course, Omni-Man coming to Earth, arriving as a sort of savior and becoming one of Earth's greatest heroes for almost 20 whole years. Nolan actually does save countless lives, but in doing so, he gains the trust of almost everyone around him, all part of his nefarious plan. Part of the Viltrum doctrine is to use the desperation of other worlds against them. Once the villain agent is well established and even well liked, they target key strengths of the planet and destroy them, whether they be governments and military assets or entire teams of heroes. They force the planet into a weakened state before demanding their surrender in order to save time and resources for the Viltrum Empire. But that is only the beginning. We cannot talk about the practices of the Viltrumite Empire if we didn't cover their one fundamental ruling: might makes right. The strong survive and the weak are culled. This first came to be during something called the Great Purge. The entire population of Viltrum engaged in a brutal civil war where everyone tried to kill everyone.
Determination and courage to get there, reach their full potential, we had to remove from our society. It was a long and difficult process. But what emerged from the ashes was unstoppable.
Only the strongest survived. Anyone less than the absolute best was killed off. That was, of course, by design. The Viltrumites decided that in order for them to become a utopian society, they needed to purge their weakest members. Over 50% of the entire population was killed in a matter of years, and the strongest surviving members became the ruling class. This practice definitely continues today, as any and all signs of weakness are met with an immediate death or execution. Failure in any sense of the world is not tolerated. Not just physical strength either. Things like empathy and compassion are also a weakness that the Viltrumite race deem unacceptable. This is their core philosophy, one of the practices or traditions that make the Viltrumites who they are. It explains a lot about how they came to form an expansionist empire seeking galactic domination, their brutal tactics in battle, and even their personalities. They deem all other races as weaker or lesser than them, and that means that the Viltrumites deserve to be their rulers. This brings us to the real World Betterment Committee, actually named the World Conquering Committee. Before Nolan got his solo mission, this functioned very differently from how we first saw. At first, the Viltrumites employed a three-step program in order to conquer planets quickly and efficiently. First, the planet was identified, and they marked out whether they had advanced enough technology to resist or put up a fight that would slow the Empire down. Planets that were less technologically advanced were put on the short list for invasion. The second stage was the deployment of mobile satellite watchtowers, which were stocked with arms and munitions and served as a sort of base for the invading team's operations. And of course, the third and final stage was invasion. A small team of Viltrumites would descend on the planet and offer them to come under the Viltrumite Empire's rule. This is far from the false kindness that Nolan operated under. The command was comply or be destroyed, and they made no political or tactical moves about it. The planet usually bent the knee, but when they didn't, the Viltrumite team destroyed enough infrastructure that it would cripple the planet entirely, leaving them no choice but to join the Viltrum Empire in the end. Stepping away from their planet-conquering traditions and into the more personal ones, the society of the Viltrum Empire functions as sort of a giant military. Everyone has their rank and role, and it must be met to the highest standard or they face execution. Children are raised to have absolute loyalty to their parents in the Viltrum Empire. Marriages are cold and calculated, more focused on producing the strongest offspring rather than out of love. They view relationships as nothing more than a selection of the strongest mate to procreate with. In fact, calling it marriage would be a stretch of the word, as many Viltrumites only couple up to produce offspring before finding another mate to produce with, a practice that recently has become a lot slower. Individuality is also seen as taboo. Even Viltrumite names are not about heritage or family, but rather concepts near and dear to the Viltrum Empire, such as conquest, or just simple single names that not only serve the function of identification and nothing more. Children are forced to excel in their chosen fields, most of which are militaristic. Most of them are raised by the Viltrum Academy more than their parents. They were forced to learn the Viltrumite practices at a young age to ensure they are completely loyal to the philosophy of the Viltrumite Empire. Speaking of Viltrumite children, the life of a Viltrumite immediately begins with rigorous testing to ensure there are no defects or weaknesses in even infants. The philosophy starts even a few seconds after birth. The weak are culled, after all. Only the strongest, purest Viltrumites are permitted the privilege of living. Training begins almost immediately if the child survives to the age of 2, that is. This brings us to the first horrific practice of childhood, the Juvenile Combat Initiative. Children as young as 5 are pitted against each other to prove their combat skills. Children aren't only placed against combatants of the same age, they often fight stronger opponents. This is, of course, to toughen them up, as they have no chance of winning. But this will increase their strength and resilience faster than than if they were to fight someone of equal power. Moving on to schooling, all children must attend the academy where the history of Viltrum is drilled into them. They are schooled on military tactics, and combat training takes up a large amount of the curriculum. Failure is, of course, met with brutal punishment, and any child could be killed at any moment for any signs of perceived weaknesses. At adolescence, the surviving children, now teens, would be assigned their first observation mission to a recently conquered planet, to see just how the Viltrum doctrine works in action, and of course, to root out any empathy or weakness among the remaining children. Another horrific tradition takes place at that moment. The adolescent is given the order to decide the fate of the surviving prisoners. Any hesitation is seen as weakness and may be punished. Those who do not choose to have the prisoners executed quickly enough may find themselves joining them in death. Of course, this trial is just the first of many before reaching adulthood. The teen now receives their first solo mission, joining a squad of the surviving teenagers, sent on a combat mission either to destroy resistors on a recently conquered planet or a rebel outpost in space. Weakness is once again the lesson of the test, and even more teenagers die. This is the horrible tradition of how childhood is for Viltrumite children. Many die long before reaching adulthood, but that is celebrated as a victory among the Viltrumite people, as now only the strongest survive to face the next part of their journey. The Viltrumite trials were one of the most brutal traditions among the Viltrum Empire. This is the final test many teenagers face before adulthood and fully joining the workforce. One final test to kill off any and all weaknesses. Even more young adults die during these trials, and only the very best of the best are allowed to live. Sent to a distant moon with gravity 3 times the strength of Viltrum's, a handful of teens are given the simple goal of surviving an entire week on a barren rock while completing a set of grueling challenges. But that would be too easy for the strict and harsh Viltrum Empire. Not only must the teens survive, but they must dominate the competition. The first task is a race across the moon's rocky surface, where gravity makes it hard to fly, making this task even harder. The top 20 winners of this race advance to the next round, the rest are executed instantly. On the second day of the trials, it is once again a trial by combat, forced to fight each other to incapacitation or death. The surviving members get to participate in Day 3's trial, a team operation where they are forced to fight against adult Viltrumite instructors, an unfair fight even with the team's advantage. But that's not the final trial, shockingly. The final trial is a free-for-all fight to the death among the surviving teenagers. Only the very best are allowed to survive. Maybe 2 to 3 of the entire generation of children survive and attain the right to become a full-grown Viltrumite. The life of a Viltrumite from a young age is filled with death and violence, and the Viltrum Empire only allows the very best to survive. Now, moving away from children to a more tragic tradition, in order to fully grasp the scale of the next tradition, we have to go back a bit in the story. It was too long before Invincible was born, and Nolan was even sent to Earth. Sometime in the past, one Viltrumite rebelled against his people. He wasn't just the average warrior, but a scientist among the Viltrumites. Knowing he had no chance of defeating or even slowing the Viltrum Empire, he created a biological weapon that may wipe them all out, himself included. The Scourge virus was almost the final nail in the coffin for the Viltrumite people. At this point, the Empire was beginning to be stretched too thin. Their brutal doctrine about childhood meant the race did not have enough of a population to keep expanding forever. At one point, they were stretched so thin that expansion by conquest was no longer feasible. This was when the Scourge virus was deployed, ravaging the Viltrumite population, killing 99.99% of them. Only 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites survived, most of them by being deployed across all corners of the galaxy and being far away enough that the virus did not infect them, and others through sheer strength and will. This left the Viltrumite planet completely covered in the dead. The surviving members, now called back to Viltrum, created the practice of launching their brethren into orbit around the planet. The cold preserved their bodies almost perfectly. When viewing Viltrum from space, it appears that it has an asteroid belt much like that of Saturn. But this asteroid belt is actually almost the entire population of the Viltrum Empire, dead and floating through space, suspended in the cold vacuum for eternity. This is how the surviving Viltrumites seem to bury their dead. It is not known if the practice continued after the Scourge virus nearly wiped out the Viltrum race, but the asteroid belt of dead Viltrumites hangs there until the destruction of the planet. Now that the population has been culled several times over, we move on to a more recent tradition. After the Viltrumite Civil War and the Scourge virus reduced the population to less than that of a small town, the Viltrumites were said to only kill each other in the most extreme of circumstances. So rare was killing among the remaining Viltrumite population, that Nolan was the first to have killed a fellow Viltrumite in generations. This is where this brutal tradition comes from. A Viltrumite execution, at first, the captured Viltrumite is allowed to regain their strength entirely, before they are escorted to the execution chamber. They are chained with their hands bound to the floor. The chains, although strong, are mostly ceremonial, as most pure-blooded Viltrumites would have little trouble actually breaking out of them. The ritual is about submission to death in order to regain a sense of honor. 2 executioners walk circles around the victim, listing off their crimes against the Empire and demanding a confession. This is not a trial. No admission or excuse would allow the victim to live. This is an admission of weakness, a submission to the doctrine of the Viltrum Empire, a sort of last rites before death in order to retain some of their honor. The executioners would then take turns beating beating the victim blow by blow before the final blow, which is a decapitation by hand. The sadistic ritual is incredibly rare, but we are all able to witness it in Season 3 when Nolan is almost killed for betraying the Viltrum Empire.
You abandon your mission to subjugate Earth. Desertion! Unapproved breeding. Murder!
The civilizations you conquered.
Maybe it was in him all along. Choose your last words.
Speaking of the Empire, we must cover the brutal tradition that it shares with most other empires. Operating as the single largest empire in the entire universe, it was created during the Great Purge when Argal the Great turned the Viltrumites into a military regime through eugenics and then pushed them to conquer other worlds in their name, thus birthing the Viltrum Empire. This, like most empires, would have operated on the basis of bloodlines. Argal the Great, being the first and greatest emperor, would have his children and descendants inherit the throne and rule. This is an issue in a society where might is right. Many of his offsprings were assassinated as competitors sought to claim the throne for themselves, but none would dare fight Argal in open combat. That is, until Thrag came along. Though Viltrumites have an incredible lifespan, they do still age. They still grow older, and eventually, after many thousands of years, begin to weaken. Thrag finally came into power when he killed Argal in a coup, many years in the making. Far from the brutal honor of the Viltrumites' way, it was a quiet and quick sneak attack. To this day, Thrag keeps Argal's skull near him at all times. It didn't end with Argal either. Thrag sought to eliminate the entire bloodline of Argal. The rules and traditions of the Empire always include power struggles and unseemly tactics, and the Viltrum Empire is no different. Those are the most disturbing traditions and practices of the Viltrum Empire. Leave a like and a comment if you think we missed any.